which are aimed at developing and improving teacher recruitment, retention, preparation, and professional development. In addition to those investments have been investments in research and specifically improvements in how we measure teacher effectiveness and how we identify effective teachers. So today, this morning, we have 4 presenters. Each presenter is an evaluator of a seed-funded grant program, and they're going to talk about a specific measure that they're using in their studies to measure teacher effectiveness or educator effectiveness. Mikhail Piatigorsky is from Impact International. He'll talk about surveys and surveys being used in WestEd's reading apprenticeship across the disciplines program. And there are some copies on your table about the reading apprenticeship program. Feel free to pick those up. And then Ben Masters will talk about the use of administrative data in evaluating the TNTP program. Shelley Rappaport will talk about teacher logs in their evaluation of Teach for America. And then finally, Josh Barnett will conclude with NIAT's TAP evaluation protocol. That's an observation protocol that's being used. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Mikhail. One quick thing. In between each presentation, the presenters will take some quick questions, and then we're going to try to quickly move to the next presenter, but we'll also have time at the end for questions.
Hi, so thank you for coming to this presentation. I'm going to be talking about the reading apprenticeship across disciplines, or RAD, the disciplines or RAD study, and specifically about the teacher survey that we use in that study to measure the impact of the intervention as well as as one of the measures of teacher effectiveness. So just a very quick program overview. In my handouts you have a much better, you have a version of the reading apprenticeship framework that you can actually read, but the intervention is built around delivering teacher training or professional development to teachers built around the reading apprenticeship framework. It's a blended delivery model where there is face-to-face, school-based team meetings, and online PLCs. It's across the disciplines between the face-to-face and the school-based meetings are cross-disciplinary, whereas the PLCs are built around specific disciplines. The disciplines are English, social studies, and science. And this particular intervention is in the middle schools, specifically grades 7 and 8. The evaluation is built around an RCT school-level randomization being conducted in 4 states, 8 districts, 40 schools, about 170 teachers. There's also a scale-up component of the project overall where the PD is being delivered to about 500 teachers this year, 1,000 more, approximately 1,000 more next school year, so it's just the delivery of the training without the evaluation component, although the teacher surveys are being administered there as well to basically gather formative feedback information there. So there is a survey component there, but I'm going to focus on the survey that's specifically used in the RCT portion. So I didn't put a kind of table of contents, but basically the 3 components that I want to talk about, and you can direct me maybe, or I'll try to read the room about which one is the most interesting, is how the survey was actually developed, how we came up with it in the project. Because it's a multi-year study, we have opportunities to revise it, so the process for revision and improvement, and then the process for administration that actually leads to high response rate and helps to reduce attrition. So first on the survey development, this is kind of the logic model for the survey in words. So we use the reading apprenticeship framework and the logic model of the project as major component, major building block for this. The resources, if you're interested, so if you kind of saw quickly metacognitive conversation. So a large part of the intervention is around metacognition and how to teach students metacognition. So it's kind of, you're teaching teachers how to teach students how to think about how they think. So it's, there's a lot of hoops to jump through. But so we use a couple of existing validated surveys as basic building blocks, the Become an Effective Leaders, Bell surveys out of University of Chicago, and Marzi scale, the metacognitive awareness of reading strategies inventory. In addition, we've benefited from several earlier studies that have been built, as the product has been developed over time, that has been funded by NSF, I3, and an earlier seed grant. So we have actually data in the relevant environments that we can use to see what worked, what didn't work, where we can take, in addition to just data about the surveys themselves, we can take data about the surveys as well as student surveys as well as student outcomes and see correlations between those and try to validate, examine the validity of the surveys a little bit further. As far as what it actually took to develop the surveys, in addition to using these resources, it's been, in this project, we kind of almost went back to the drawing board to kind of re-examine our assumptions about prior instruments that have been used, to look at the prior data, which involved a lot of time by both program and evaluation staff with extensive discussions over time. And of course, this is a minor point, but worth making, that when you're actually kind of writing your own instruments that are going to be, so then somebody has to take the time and read through that and answer your questions. It's important to do the quality control on this. You forget that instruments that you can get from somebody else, they have gone through this so that there are no typos, no, just misused words. The output is that we have a 20-minute online survey aligned to the program framework and logic model. And here's a little bit more about the survey itself. Of course, whenever you have the survey, one of the issues you have to deal with is kind of scope drift. You get into, well, if I have an opportunity to ask teachers something, I want to ask them about everything, and you have to kind of watch that. But there are important and different uses for the survey. So for all teachers, we ask, the main thing here is the instructional practices. That's what actually gets you the measure of teacher effectiveness, at least based on the theory of action about what's effective teaching. In addition to that, you need some teacher characteristics because, as most people here know, you get the characteristics of the students. Characteristics of the teachers are much harder to get, but might be very important in predicting their in helping you understand their performance, at least on your measures. So you want some additional things like experience, education, et cetera. And the easiest way to do that, if you're going to be asking them something, the easiest way to get that information is to ask them for it, rather than try to get their personnel records or something like that. In addition to that, for the treatment teachers, there are also other uses of the survey. So we have some questions about participation in treatment, although we also gather that more directly, but we also ask it here, and it helps us to measure implementation. And we get feedback specific to the, to the PD they're receiving. What is their feedback? And that helps with formative evaluation improvement. We ask them about challenges to be, is the school supporting you as you implement this new form of instruction? And then open-ended general feedback that can help with, how's the program going? If you get an answer, I don't even know what you're talking about, that gives you, some very valuable feedback about what's going on in the classroom. A little bit more on what the instructional practices are. This is the kind of overall list. We look at the breadth of reading opportunities, so not just the textbook and not just the assigned reading, but kind of being a little bit more proactive about it. Supporting content of the text, so the supporting students' efforts to comprehend the actual kind of content of the text, fostering and supporting student collaboration, metacognitive inquiry, the use of additional specific comprehension strategies, and instruction that promotes equity, or the scales that we use from some earlier studies were called negotiating success, but so targeting your instruction to the level of individual students as opposed to just to the middle student. And here are some examples. I know it's a little bit hard to read. The main point here is that we ask about teachers. So you'll notice, and I'll come back to this point, during the past 4 weeks, how often do you do the following in your target class? In the target class, it's an online survey, and we have the information, so that's actually populated for a specific classroom. Did you do these things that we take from the metacognitive, that are built around the metacognitive practices? And then did the students do these things that kind of correlate to that? And a large part of the instruction is to actually get the teachers to get the students to do these things in the classroom, not just to get away from the I'm just lecturing to you like I am right now. And then, of course, we also we have a student survey, so that kind of can reinforce the data on this. So students get to report both on what the teacher they think did in the classroom and what they remember being asked to do in the classroom. So we have multiple points to triangulate the answer. And then why the past four weeks, the survey is being administered 3 times in the first year when the PD is actually being given, and I'm way over time, so I'll probably spend most of it on this. And then twice in the second year. The second year, there's no additional PD. They're supposed to be kind of, have absorbed the new training, and have been, have absorbed all of it, because the PD is it's finishing right now, basically in May. And then so next year, they will have had the full breadth of it. So because these are repeated surveys, we have to adjust to that, and we can take advantage of that as well. So we use, to reduce the recall bias, we say, we define a period of time that's not too long, and this has evolved over time as well, and ask them to think about what they did in the past 4 months. You can also, you could vary the timing based on if you really think that the instruction kind of changes over the school year, but it has to be uniform enough because we're in many locations. So we decided not to kind of target our instructional questions to, the beginning of the year, did you do, are you doing something different? It's an online survey, so you get to, if somebody didn't answer on the first survey, didn't answer correctly about their experience, the years of experience, you can ask them again. But you don't have to ask everybody. You can actually target it to the people who didn't answer the first time. Treatment feedback, you can adjust that based on, so the winter survey, for example, was right after winter face-to-face training, so you can target your questions that way. And because you're repeating, you can reduce the overall length of the survey a little bit. If there are general questions that are really not time sensitive, you only want to have one answer to them, you can kind of use them strategically, not ask them all in the first survey. You can spread them out. So let me really quickly go through the analysis part. The analysis is here because we get to redesign. Otherwise, this would be in the kind of the impact analysis portion of it. But because we get a chance to redesign, it's important to do this quickly, not just kind of have these stack up until the end of the project, and then you do all your QC and you find out that, oops, we had some issues. You can actually kind of revise and improve. So you look at missing data, wrong data, breakoff points, people straight lining the survey, issues of administration, and you can also do look at the construct reliability and item analysis to see if any questions are not working, If you need to adjust them, since you have the opportunity, of course, it does get into the issue of you might not have the same measure throughout, but if that's not that important, what might be more important is the quality of the overall instrument. So this is just some basic, reliability by construct from the first administration. So we can see that they're all performing fairly well. Some are doing a little bit worse than others, but all are within kind of acceptable thresholds and even good thresholds. And then we can look at individual constructs, look at item analysis. So what happens if you take out one item? How does that affect the overall reliability? And you can see, for example, there's an example of a question about, do your students work in mixed ability groups? Doesn't seem to be adding to that construct. So we may want to consider dropping that item. All right. So since I only have 2 minutes, let me jump into so this is the hard work initially of what actually, gets you the responses, and I'm sure everybody here is familiar with this, but this is where all the legwork is, and you have to start early, you have to start from the start. So the first thing that we've had to do is build relationships with teachers, schools, regional partners, everybody involved, principals to the extent that you can get to them without bothering them too much. But it is crucial to get that as early as you possibly can, without understanding that not everybody that you speak with in August is going to be there by September. Establishing a timeline, both internally and communicating that to everybody who's involved as early as possible, because they want to plan their year and need to know this in advance. Track the response rate as things are happening. And you can do that with online surveys much better than with other administrations, but actually keeping an eye on it as it happens. Incentives are important, and follow-up is, again, crucial because I'm not presenting it here, but I've seen where we start and where we end in terms of response rate, and that's all due to follow-up. In terms of establishing timeline, just repeating the point that the people in the schools need to know this. So you can't. It's important, it's good practice, project management practice, to establish it as early as you can, but you need to actually communicate it to everybody involved. And then taking into account everybody's testing, so the timelines have to be customized to your participants. And then plan the follow-up, and I know I'm out of time, so incentives, everybody knows the benefits of this. I will have to say that contributing to research that will improve literacy, we have certainly said it. I don't know to what extent that has motivated people. Other incentives help. The follow-up is crucial, and this is just the main, and it's another heavy lift. We do heads-up emails, then we send an email about, so before we ever send the link, we send an email saying, we're going to send you the link. Then we send the link, then we have reminders, then in between reminders, we actually call people. And in addition to this is the teachers who are responding, we find a data collection coordinator at each school. So somebody, because it's not fair to make every teacher responsible for issues that might be happening with the school. We didn't take into account some additional testing that we didn't know about. That should be the data coordinator, who could be one of the study teachers or it could be somebody else. But establishing an additional point of contact and then follow up with, takes a village. So follow up with everybody possible to get to all the majority of the teachers are going to be responsive, but for the ones who are not, sometimes it takes an assault on all fronts to get them to respond. This is the result. This is the patting ourselves on the back. I know that I've learned that we're by far, the bar has been set even higher by some of the other grantees, but this is a good response rate that we certainly would not get without all that hard effort at the start and throughout the administration.
think we have time for one question. And I'll
Good.
So say, do you let teachers know at the very beginning of the process that part of participation in
Yep.
this grant is to complete those surveys?
Yep. So that's part of the consent process. So it's from the start. We outline both for, and it's a little, so both treatment and control teachers do the survey. Some of the other components are different based on whether you're in treatment and control. But yes, that's part of the consent process itself. Although we've certainly had to remind people after the fact, because this, you put it in every document and every time you say, and you still have to remind them.
I just had a question about the software you use. Is that Qualtrics?
No, it's Lime, which, and I don't do the programming itself, and I think we're moving away from it for whatever reason, but we found it sufficiently simple to use, whereas the software that our survey division is moving to is like only they can use it. And for something like this, there's not enough of a benefit. So there's definitely more complicated stuff but then it's, it's more out of your hands. So I think.
we'll take questions at the end too.
Mm-hmm.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to be presenting on the potentially dry, but I hope practical topic of administrative data collection in districts when studying teacher outcomes. I'm presenting from my practical experience working on a grant in 3 large urban school districts. And just a little bit of context, the intervention is a program being managed by TNTP, which is multifaceted. And specifically, it's about the creation of a district-owned sustainable pipeline for new teacher recruitment, selection, training, certification, on-the-job support in high-needs areas. So there's a lot going on in this program. And we're interested not only in how does the intervention play out, but also in the handoff to the district, because the idea is after this grant period is over, that the districts would take over this intervention, this program, and adopt it as their own if it's successful. So 2 of the challenges that we have when we were designing the evaluation, one is that by design this intervention is about new teachers for whom there isn't prior data in the district. And the other is that we're interested in individual level data, but also interested in district-wide outcomes, because this is about a recruitment pipeline for districts. And for our impact analysis, we specifically considered 3 types of outcomes. One is student learning as measured by achievement gains, and we're comparing that for students taught by teachers from this pipeline versus other comparable new teachers. The second category of outcomes is teacher-level outcomes, professional outcomes, such as performance and other things. And the third category of outcomes is sort of more descriptive, but it's a pre-post comparison for the district of teacher recruitment-related outcomes and sort of the teacher labor market in each district. So I'll start by just walking you through some of the outcomes we decided that we wanted to investigate, and then talk about some of the more practical challenges of trying to get administrative data on these outcomes in the districts. So one of our primary outcomes is student-level achievement data. Including which students were taught by which teachers. Then at the teacher level, we were interested in teachers' job retention, teachers' job evaluations as defined by the districts, and teacher job attendance. And of these, job retention is one that is a confirmatory or primary outcome for us because it's something that is a pretty consistent measure across districts. Job evaluations are data for which we don't have baseline performance data because these are new teachers, and for which there can be variation across districts and exactly how they define that, and similar with attendance. So those are more exploratory for us. And then finally, on the descriptive end, we're interested in the district's labor market as a whole, and so we want to look at that in terms of the volume and type of job applicants they receive in each year, and also looking at their job vacancies and how successful they are in filling them. And then finally, I don't have a bullet for it, but an important part of our study is to try to understand the costs of the program, because that's of great interest to the districts as they think about adopting it as their own. So on the challenges of data collection related to each of these. So on the item student level data and linking teachers and students, fortunately, increasingly districts are savvy about this, and they actually have systems for linking teachers and students that are vetted and are thoughtfully designed. But that's not always the case, especially in smaller districts. And I'd say two key points when thinking about trying to link teachers to students in a context in which the district doesn't traditionally do it. One is to be very cautious and consider multiple sources of evidence when trying to accurately link teachers and students. So for example, a district might have documentation that lists homeroom teachers, but not necessarily, that isn't necessarily the same teacher-student link as the teachers with their courses. So very important to cast a wide net if you're trying to create this from scratch, and also be interacting with district colleagues to make sure you understand the data they're handing to you, and not to ever assume that, okay, just because this teacher happens to be linked to this student, that is necessarily a teaching relationship, or that teacher is the primary teacher of the student, complications like that. On the general category of teacher level outcomes, one of the key challenges in our study is that we're not just interested in new teachers as a big group, but really about new teachers in certain types of job roles that are higher needs. And so you have to be very thoughtful about the administrative data you collect in order to be able to define that type of teacher in your data. So for example, if you want special education teachers or math teachers, the districts are frequently not set up to have an indicator of just the type of teacher that your study is focused on. So you've got to think through, what are all the data I have, the course rosters, the certification data, the information about the vacancy that the teacher filled, that can all sort of help you triangulate on, okay, what is a teacher of this type, and then I can find a comparable teacher of the same type so that I'm comparing apples to apples when I'm looking at teacher level outcomes. And specifically on these pieces, on the job retention piece, it was important for us to think through what exactly do we mean by job retention. Is it job in the school? Is it in the role that the teacher started in? Is it in the district as a whole? Is it in the teaching profession? And different districts will have different amounts of data about each of those different outcomes. So it depends on your intervention which one of those you care about, but that's something to think carefully about before you make a request to a district of what type of information will I really need to understand the retention outcome that's relevant for me. Job attendance, I would just say that different districts measure it in different ways, and if you want an apples to apples comparison, you got to think through different reasons teachers aren't on the job, whether it's sick days or professional development days, things like that. So being aware of the different categories and trying to make sure you're getting the information on all those different categories of attendance. And then we've had an interesting time working at the district level on the sort of teacher labor market outcomes. So job applicant data, and this is an example of a case where if a district is interested in this outcome, you can really partner with them to think through what should they be systematically collecting. Districts are doing screenings of applicants, and often in a systematic way, but they may not be documenting the things that they're considering, whether it's teacher certification types or teacher characteristics, and so working with them to see how they're going to be collecting that data, especially once the intervention is entering play, is important. And then on the job vacancy piece, this can be challenging because you imagine that a vacancy isn't just a static thing. Job vacancies are constantly opening up and being closed in districts. And so unless you pre-plan with your district how you're going to collect this, getting a snapshot at any given time is not going to give you the answers you need. You really need a plan to be gathering longitudinal data on, well, not longitudinal, but over time data on vacancies as they open up and what their outcomes were, how they perhaps got transformed, because that can happen. A principal can have a vacancy of type A and say, okay, well, let's hire a teacher but make it a type B teacher because we couldn't find a type A teacher. So those are all considerations to think about when trying to study the teacher labor market side of things. And then finally, Chris asked me to speak a little bit to attrition considerations with regard to our impact analysis. That wasn't the biggest issue for us because we're studying student level outcomes, and so there is some, but not much differential attrition in students from the start of the year to the time in which they're tested. And then our other primary outcome is teacher retention, which is sort of an attrition outcome. It's whether the teacher's still in your data or in your school, in our case. So that is just my quick run through of some of the experiences we had and challenges we had with administrative data, but I'm happy to answer questions and brainstorm this with any of you. Thanks.
So 1 or 2 questions?
Yeah.
I was curious how you thought about kind of attrition versus counseling out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was going to mention that. So when thinking about the definition of retention, for our study, we're defining it as voluntary retention. A counseling out is a very tricky category, right? So sort of 3 different definitions you could use. You could use voluntary versus involuntary retention, so that accounts for straight out dismissals. In our case, we can also link it to teacher evaluation data. And so if you see a teacher with the lowest evaluation score, then you might consider, well, is that really a successful retention, or do you want to limit your outcome to be focused on retention of more effective teachers as weighted by the district, because that's really probably what the district cares about. So it depends a little on your research question, but I think there are a couple ways to get at that.
How do you end up doing
We are going to look at retention of effective teachers using the evaluation data, and all the districts appear to have sort of a similar low-performing category, which is there aren't that many teachers in it, but it's pretty consistent, and I think that's the district's focus. So, yeah.
I was just wondering, for our project, we wanted to try and confirm like schools' Title I status and some other information, and we had difficulty getting accurate information even from the principals. So I was wondering where you went to get the most cooperation and where you were able to get the best data when you were trying to gather administrative information.
Yeah, I mean, we have the advantage of working with pretty large urban districts, so we went to the district level, and I tend to find they're much more data savvy and able to provide consistent data than individual schools. I'm not sure on the piece of Title I category where else you might look. I assume there are a variety of places that could be classified, but I haven't had to look for that. So
Like
yeah.
you said, they're kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
We ended up triangulating a bunch of information to get to where we were going, but we thought it was kind of stunning that when we call,
Right.
so these guys had a lot of experience with that there's just a lack of information, general information about their school. And,
Yeah, you think it would relate to funding, so it would be
Yeah.
top of mind, but yeah. So,
We'll take more questions.
sure.
at the end.
Thank you.
To comparable teachers in comparable districts. So first we look to see which districts look like the districts that feed into the Tulsa Institute, which is where we have the intervention. And then beyond that, we look to make sure that those teachers within those districts are matched to each other. So it's propensity score matching. That's basically what the design is. We're collecting a ton of data. Today we're going to talk about the logs, but just so you know what we're collecting, we have a lot of TFA data on teachers. So that helps us with the propensity score matching. And it'll eventually help us with the retention information, because we're definitely looking to see if this new model of training keeps teachers in teaching longer. We're also collecting from TFA these surveys that they conduct all the time. So they do in the first year, I have to remember to speak into this, that the first year they do surveys 4 times, one around induction, and then the first 8 weeks of teaching, and so on. So we're collecting those, and those are mostly to look at teacher attitudes and how do they feel about their schools, Teach for America, the whole experience. We are also doing observations at the Tulsa Institute. So my colleague who's sitting over there, my partner in crime, Kelly Granito, we spent a lot of time this summer in Tulsa, and actually we really liked it. And so we spent time watching the training, which we knew what to expect from the training because we watched the teachers being trained throughout the year. So we went to see how well they stuck to their model. And then we also observed the Teach for America teachers while they taught summer school, because part of what they do during the institute is they practice teaching kids. And then we did focus groups with a sample of those teachers plus the trainers, and we did that in Tulsa, but we also did it in our 2 comparison institutes. All right, so the other thing is the logs, which is what I'll talk about now. So the reason we did logs is because we wanted to answer this question. How do the instructional practices of CMS's core members who take the redesign training differ from those of core members who take the current training? Now, one way to do that would be to do observations. But those, for many reasons, are not a very logical thing to do because, first of all, TFA teachers are all over the country. It's not like we're working with only 5 districts. We would definitely have to go all over the place. And it's very expensive. The other thing is that you only get to do that like once. But with logs, you get to see what teachers are doing all the time. So I'm going to show you these logs. These are not our logs, but I've worked with logs in a number of projects by now. And these are the logs that were developed for the Instructional Improvement Study out of University of Michigan by Carenti and Rowan and Cambert. And so we use these in an earlier study. And basically what it is, it's just getting a snapshot of what is going on in the classroom on that day. So for this old study, we gave teachers a list of randomly assigned students. We said, today you're going to log for this student, tomorrow you're going to log for that student. Because we had, a limited number of schools, we could do that. But with TFA, we couldn't because there are just too many schools to deal with. So I'll get to that. Okay, so basically they're just saying whether they focused on something that day, whether they touched on it briefly, and they didn't teach it at all. So for this study, we did 8 logs in like a 3-week period. All right. This time, what we did is they filled out logs weekly for the whole school year, which is a really big ask. So we looked at math and ELA teachers, so just a subset of the teachers who went through the program, and the same in the comparison ones. And this is the kind of letter we sent at the beginning. And what you should take from this is that filling out a log is really easy. You just choose someone whose name starts with a certain letter, because we couldn't do random assignment of students. They click on this link because it's electronic. You enter your teacher ID, you answer the questions, and then there's the treat yourself, which is a gift card that comes immediately. So there's no, when am I going to get my gift card? Okay, so this is what the logs look like. And one of the really cool things about them is that you can do them on your smartphone. So, core members are the kind of people who you can be pretty sure have a smartphone. You can do it on computer, but we wanted to make this really easy because it's every week. And they only take 5 minutes to fill out. And you get $5 after filling it up. So this is what it looks like. You enter your ID, you say whether you're teaching math or ELA, and that's because it changes for elementary school teachers. We do math one week, and then these open-ended logs, which I'll talk about, and then math, then ELA the next week, and so on and so on. And so, okay, so these are the measures we're using. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but for the math, there are two types of logs. So this is the first type of log. It's a checklist log. It's basically, did you do these things in the classroom, in the math classroom? And these are based on the Common Core mathematical practices. I'm going to rush through these. And then a nice thing about these is because we can't get out and train a lot of people on how to use these logs, you can hover these underlined words. We're asking people, have you tried, are your students trying alternative solutions to a math problem? Well, do we all mean the same thing by that? Well, maybe not. So you can hover over any underlined idea, and it tells you this is what we mean by that. This is just an example of what it looks like if you do it on the computer and what it looks like if you do it on the phone. So basically, you're answering one, and then you're clicking on the next question. I think it's pretty cool. Okay. For ELA, we have these open-ended logs, which are not a checklist. And they also only take about 5 minutes, but we're asking a really big question so Teach for America really wants teachers to do things like Common Core instructional practices, but also Teach for America has big ideas about what a good teacher should do. And so they have these 4 ideas called core practices. And so here's an example of 2. You can't really see them. One of them is called teaching towards an instructional goal, and the other one is positioning students as competent sense makers. And they ask questions like, what are you teaching? They want to know, are teachers teaching something that matters, and why are they doing it? Are they balancing student culture and rigor? And so these questions try to get at that. So this first one in the corner asked basically, what are you teaching? What did you teach this week in one of your classes, and why do you think it matters? And so when we get those back, we code those using a qualitative program, Deduce. Okay. And that is what it looks like for the open-ended questions. All right, so how are we getting people to do this every week, all year? So first, we're making it easy. You saw how easy it was to click on something and just, answer the questions. We try to be really clear. We have a website that people can go to if they have any questions. They also know that they can contact us with any questions. And then they have available to them very easy instructions about what to do, and we're constantly writing to them. We're very consistent, so the logs never change. The checklist logs never change. Every week, same thing. The open-ended ones do, but they're very broad, and anyone can answer them. We listen to their complaints, like if they didn't get a gift card, which doesn't actually happen very much, but we listen to them, and we listen to what it is that is important to them, and I'll talk more about that. We have, as I said, lots of information. We follow through, and we're really nice to them. Okay, so those are very basic ways that we get people to continue to do it, but there's some other ways that we do that, and one is that our team worked with people, with a behavioral insights team at MDRC to find out, well, what is it that makes a core member want to do this every week? And so when we started the logs, the first thing we did is ask them, what's making you do this? And one of the things we found out is because these are core members and they're in Teach for America, what really mattered to them was making a difference. And since this could help teachers, TFA, have better training in the future, which eventually, helps kids, then they wanted to do that. So a lot of what we write to them is based on that idea that, hey, you are doing something by filling this out to help kids. What else? I want to get through quickly because, all right, so the other thing is we've had really good response rates. So between 70 and 80%. I know it's not as high as what Mikhail said, but it is weekly. And so this is another message we send them that says, hey, you have answered, you're almost at the point where you've answered 80% of all your logs. We're going to give you a $25 gift card if you do. But you know what? Here's why it's so important, because it's not a random number. 80% from each teacher is actually really important. And because we know also that the TFA members are really into this idea of research, we like to tell them about how this is working and why we're doing what we're doing. Okay. We also monitor. So this is an example. Someone hasn't filled out their survey in 5 weeks, so this automatically comes to them and says, hey, you haven't filled them out. We'd love you to come back. This week we're going to give you $10. Why don't you come back? This is another one saying, hey, you've done a great job filling them out for the past 10 weeks. We're going to give you an extra $5. At the end, we'll be asking them why they filled out the logs, what motivated them, why they didn't fill out logs on the weeks that they didn't, so that we can learn from that and hopefully, do a better job next time. And then finally, a gift card never hurts. So they get that. And it's not just Starbucks, but a bunch that they can choose from. I guess, did I make it in perfect timing? Yes?
I'm just intrigued by the behavioral insight team. What did they provide you what did they do?
Well, there are a lot of things that they helped us with. So one is deciding how often to do the logs. And one of the things we talked about, well, if we only did it 3 weeks out of the month, which we were thinking of doing, then there's no habit, because there's always this week that's missed. So we decided we're going to do this every week just to get people in the habit. Another thing was this idea of trying to find out what is it that motivates Teach for America teachers. And what we found out from an early survey is that they really want to do something to help kids. They also are really intrigued by research, and they'd like to do that one day. They like the incentives, and they actually really like the idea of having like a self-reflection time every week, which this helps them do. That, oh, this is what I did this week. So it helped us the letters that went out are based on what we think is going to motivate the TFA teachers to fill these out. Mm-hmm.
Did you give them feedback on the data? Like, did you give them results?
Well, we don't have the results yet. It's still going on. Kelly and I have been coding the qualitative open-ended logs, but the checklist logs haven't been analyzed yet. But we will use that information, give formative feedback to TFA, which is what we did with our focus groups and observations.
How confident are you that the behaviors you're watching during the course of the year really trace back to differences in Summer Institute experience?
So that's a really good question. It would take a long time to answer. So I don't know. You want to help me out?
I mean, I would say, especially with the open-ended logs, the questions that we ask are generated from these core practice ideas that TFA created, and then part of their intervention was to kind of hammer those ideas home with their core members at the Intervention Institute. So the things that we're asking are like directly related to the ideas that they're getting at Institute, or in theory that they're supposed to be getting at Institute. And I guess the same would be with the checklist logs as well. The core components were things that kind of guided the whole delivery of instruction at Institute.
Yep. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I have the unenviable task of being between you and a break. Fortunately, it is an early break, so hopefully we can get through all of this material together. Having learned a little bit about the surveys and administrative data and the logs, we're now turning our attention to what is a teacher observational tool, the instrument that we use to observe teachers and sort of our practice and approach for doing so. So I want to take just a couple of minutes and kind of introduce the TAP system to you, or at least tell you a little bit about it for those of you who are familiar with it, but walk through so you have an understanding of what is this system that this observational tool is embedded within, and then talk through kind of the rubric itself, and then a little bit about who uses it and how it is used. So the TAP system is essentially these four core elements interrelated in an attempt to try to transform and advance educator effectiveness, which for us is the trigger to then ultimately changing and improving student achievement. I'll tell you now that this observational tool is used in a couple of hundred schools across the country, in a TIF 4 grant, a TIF 5 grant, and we are also in about 50 universities. In a couple of seed grants as well in pre-service education. So it is being used in sort of all across the elements and different opportunities that we have here today, and in a variety of different places across the country. So for about 20 years, we as an organization have used this instrument across approximately about 1 million observations at this point across those 20 years. So we feel like we have a pretty good understanding of how to do this and how to observe teachers, and at least our approach to do so, which is the point of sharing this with you today. So talking a little bit again about what is this system that this rubric is embedded within across those four core elements. So we start with multiple career pathways. We talked about this quite a bit in the large section earlier, and we've talked about it throughout our discussion. For us, we have career mentor and master teacher pathways. Mentor and master teachers conduct observations on the career teachers. They're trained and certified. And so again, that kind of role of that master and mentor teacher is to lead what we call cluster cycles, which is the professional development cycle that we use across our schools. Support teachers' individual growth plans, so those teachers then identify by using this rubric, which indicator do they need to have an area of reinforcement on, that is your success, and what area do you need to have a refinement on. And you only get one of those per observation. And then you get strategies associated with that, so it's individualized to each person. You conduct observations, evaluations, and post-conferences, provide that individualized teacher support, and then obviously participate on the leadership team. So that purpose of that leadership team is ultimately the responsibility for the overall implementation of the system, and they're engaged in constantly monitoring specific processes in their school to make sure it adheres to implementation, double-checking, making sure that everything's going the way that we want it to. Ongoing applied professional growth is, again, centered on our idea of cluster groups led by that master mentor teacher. It's a strategy that they use to implement, a structure that they use to implement strategies within the school. So teachers participate in these weekly. They average between about 60 and 90 minutes depending on the school structure, but it's ultimately their opportunity to examine student data, engage in collaborative planning, and then learn the instructional strategies that are then field tested in each individual school. So that strategy isn't dropped in because we think it works or a book told us that it works. That strategy is field tested in each individual school to make sure it works with the students in that school environment, so that they know when they bring it back to cluster, that teacher says, here's the student work from the field test. Here's exactly what the students were asking me. Here's what the high-flying students ask. Here's what my struggling students ask. Here's what the average student asks. So they're able to integrate that into that school environment based on the information they know about the other students in that school. So that professional development continues through a constant cycle of that monitoring from master teachers, modeling lessons, observing classroom instruction, and then supporting each individual teacher to develop that. This is sort of our steps for that cluster and how it works, sort of the 5-step process that we go through. I'll jump over that and get to kind of instructionally focused accountability, which is in essence the rubric for us that we're going to focus on today. So teachers in TAP schools are observed in classroom instruction multiple times per year. Most of our schools use 3 to 4 observations throughout the year. In most of our university partnerships, they're using 4 performance assessment observations throughout the year, ranging from throughout their clinical experience if they're in year-long internships. If they're in semester-long, then it's usually 3 observations. And so again, it's just an opportunity for the folks to be able to get through that. All of our evaluators are certified. They complete a 3-day evaluator training, and then they complete a certification exam at the end of that that includes watching an observational video and scoring it next to our national raters, and also answering questions from a post-conference section. So that way it's not just the observation itself, but the power of any tool is really that discussion that happens thereafter. So that's that moment to share with you the strategies and change your actual practice. The evaluation results are seen as formative feedback for that one-on-one coaching session, and then guide planning and individualized professional development. The rubric is based on a litany of different evaluation instruments and standards we looked at across the country. It was built up over a period of about 10 years in the 90s of a discussion, a lot of different focus groups with leading research at the time. We have validated this throughout the last 20 years. There's a ton of research on it. If you're interested in it, certainly come see me after. I'll give you my card. I can certainly send that and share that with you. So let's take a little bit deeper dive under the hood and see what do some of those standards really look like. So this is just an example so you can kind of understand the way that our particular rubric works. So in this case, you see that we have 19 different indicators spread across 4 domains. Each domain, pointed out politely there with a red arrow, is intended so that every time you know exactly what you're looking at: instruction, planning and design, as well as the learning environment itself. And then there's a responsibility section of those 4 domains. We have an indicator, and again, those are the sort of 19 different indicators that we have going across there. That's what we think those 19 indicators provide access to what effective instruction should look like. So if you're doing these things, then again, that should be the trigger to see a correlation between student achievement. And so we've got some evidence on that as well in other studies that we've done with that correlation. Next, we look at the descriptors. So what's within each one of those different indicators? And obviously that's where the real nuts and bolts comes into it, is how do we interpret that? That's the part that gets tweaked, as you can imagine, for pre-service teachers in our university partnerships, because they're in a different environment. It's not their classroom per se. They're walking in and teaching in someone else's world. So we have to tweak the way that the learning environment works and some of the other indicators. But that comes into that descriptor conversation. And then finally, you'll see the performance levels. For us, we only have a 1, 3, 5 performance level. So it's a 5-point scale. And then we let, in the training that we do for our evaluators, that's where you understand, and at the bottom of our instrument, the difference between the 1 and the 3 and the 3 and the 5 is the 2 and the 4. And so what we've learned is to not be overly prescriptive about what the 2 and the 4 is, because again, if I'm an evaluator and I've determined what these 3 levels are, and I think you're some 3, some 1, or partly 3, partly 1, that helps me use my own discretion to give you that 2, or do I give you the 3? And so rather than allocating it and then someone saying, well, based on these indicators, you were 3 of these and 3 of these, I'm not sure which to give you, because everything was accounted for. So for our experience, that was a better approach based on those observations in the field. Just to give you a snapshot of what each one of those indicators look like across each domain. So again, back to planning, 3 different indicators there: responsibility survey, environment, and then instruction is obviously our biggest piece of it with 12 indicators there. So that gives you a sense of how we kind of weight each one of the domains as we produce a score, overall score for the teacher. Again, looking at the process of this and the way that we execute it, so 3 to 4 observations annually. depending on the school environment and the school that we're working with. At least half of those observations are unannounced. Traditionally, you do 2 announced and 2 unannounced. The reason for the announced observation is because there is a pre-conference. So we do a pre-conference observation and then the post-conference. The unannounced obviously is just the observation and the post-conference. But that announced observation gives you an opportunity to have a discussion with that teacher about what you think should happen in that classroom. What's supposed to happen? What am I going to see? Then I get to go observe it and see what actually happens. And if certainly when I was a newer teacher, they didn't always go the way that I wanted it to. I could tell you exactly what I wanted to have happen, but that is not the way that it always went. But that then helps me in that post-conference understand the conversation about what was your thinking beforehand. What did you go in there with a plan to do? Or did you really not have a plan and it either went well or it went terribly, but I don't know whether or not you're able to plan instruction well. So that's the value of that pre-conference and why we do observations that are both announced and unannounced. So we also want to have that consistent collaboration across evaluators for inter-rater reliability, again, the pre-conference and post-conference. And then how does this information get collected and used? So you can imagine if you're a principal and you're going to do 30 observations across all of your teachers, a master teacher is going to do another 30, a mentor teacher is going to do another 30. So we do have a complementary data management system that houses all of this observational data that gets put into it. So as you complete each observation, it goes into, you can do it on an iPad or you can do it on your computer when you get back, but you're scripting that lesson, taking notes, and then you go back and put it into your system. That dashboard, as a principal, summarizes for you everything that you've done. How many observations have you completed in the cycle? How many do you need to complete through the year? What's your most likely, or what's the most common area of reinforcement and refinement across your school? So that you can imagine that gives me information as the principal to determine what do I need to do for professional development at this school. If 25 of my 30 teachers got an area of refinement that was on grouping students, I should probably bring in some professional development about grouping students. Or I should probably talk to my master teacher about embedding that grouping students strategy into that cluster cycle. So again, that's the structure that we have in place to embed those different strategies. So ultimately that gives you a sense of how does the information get used, both in aggregate for the principal and for the master teacher to have a sense, but you can also look across your observers. So again, if I'm a principal and I see that Chris has given most of the teachers in the school a 4, 4.5, and a 5, and I look and see that another observer has given them 1s and 2s, I should probably have a conversation with my 2 evaluators to figure out where the difference is, what's going on, because you're giving these teachers different feedback. So is that a rater issue? Is that a misunderstanding of the instrument? But again, all of that information is embedded there for you to access easily. Again, the application, so it's used as that summative measure throughout the end of the school year. In our evaluations, looking across multiple grant cycles, we're always looking for the growth in teacher effectiveness. One of those measures is by change and improvement in the instructional observational scores, as well as improvement in student scores. And then more importantly for us is that constant formative feedback, the opportunity to constantly give them the data and the strategies to change. And that's sitting down with them, looking at the rubric itself so that they understand exactly which indicator and which descriptor you're talking about. We also include performance-based compensation, which we won't talk about too much, but I'll get to kind of the takeaways of why we think this works and why we think this approach is the right approach. First, for us, it gives us a singular focus. We're always focused on the three goals of our grants that are to improve educator effectiveness through teachers, improve administrator effectiveness, and then also to improve student achievement. But for us, that lever for student achievement is the teacher. So our rubric is the basis for all of the decisions that we make for the entire system. Second, a comprehensive set of integrated elements. So again, for us, that structure works where we have professional development that's based on a rubric. The instructional conversations are based on the rubric, the strategies that come into play. So everything feeds off of that use of a high quality instrument that then allows us to implement and operate the system. For us, the important piece of this is a balance of accountability and support. So you can imagine if you're working with a new school district and you say, we want to use our observational tool 3 to 4 times, and you're going to have these other individuals, you're telling every teacher in your school 3 or 4 people are going to pass through your class every year and do observations. So that many of the knee-jerk responses is, please don't do that. I'm not sure if I want that. But it's that balance of accountability and support. We all know that it's not effective to do the once-a-year drive-by observation. Most of these observations are for a full hour as well. So you're imagining a person being there. But it's the support. That master teacher isn't actually dropping in your class 4 times a year. He or she's dropping in your class probably weekly, because it's the strategy that they told you in the hallway or at the cluster meeting last week. They're passing by. It's only the formal observation that's 3 or 4 times. So it's a balance of that accountability and support. For us, it's always, how do I know what that common language is? How do we know what the support structure should look like? How do we know that all of our schools across the country are operating towards a common goal? And so the rubric gives us that baseline. Finally, our next is to attract, retain, develop, and compensate effective teachers. Obviously a theme that many of us are trying to do in the work that we do every day, and that the government is supporting us through these different opportunities. Ultimately, we see the results of this when you have this integrated system, singular focus, balance of accountability and support. And you know, you can certainly follow up with me after with dozens of studies on the system and the impact of it, from a teacher survey, administrator data, student support data. So thank you for the chance to explain our instrument and the way that we approach teacher observation.
So questions for Josh?
You said that the observation is used in multiple states, is that correct?
Yes.
How do you deal with teacher evaluations? And is this in a supplement to their evaluations? I'm thinking of specifically state-required evaluations. Or is it instead of the same state evaluations? I'm just trying to think of implementation, because that's
Sure.
a real tough one when you're in a state that's very prescriptive.
Yeah, it's a great question. In all of the states, we work with 12 states, and all of the states and the schools that we work with, it is used by itself. So it is always used in beyond whatever the state is requiring them to do. So some districts have a waiver for it, and so that they've used it as a replacement for the state rubric, whatever the state rubric may be, if they have one. And some states do not that we work. But good question. Yes, sir.
In terms of observer certification, I mentioned observers get trained initially and then they go through a 3-day training and an observer certification process. Given that you're spread out across a large variety of schools, what are you doing in terms of like drift assessment to ensure that observers over time still stay true to that original observer certification? Or are you finding that different schools over time tend to migrate towards rating things a certain way because of their own internal culture and things like that? Is it better for a school system to have its own internal reliability, or are you looking for that objective reliability compared to the criterion of your test?
Yeah, great question. So our evaluation certification is every year.
Okay.
So you're not sort of certified for multiple years. You're certified, and we encourage them to get certified every year. That lets us constantly refresh the videos that they're watching. We do some analysis on the questions that are, seeing how the questions work within our test bank. So if a question isn't working, we can take it down and replace it with another one for next year. So that's kind of our way of assessing it and making sure that it happens each year. In addition, as I mentioned, for the principal, they can watch and observe if someone is moving too far afield. So again, you don't pass the test if you rate it too far differently from our national rater overall or by indicator. So you can only miss the rating on certain indicators by a certain amount, and then the average score by a certain amount. And so again, we all have that information that we can share back. And on the misfortune that someone doesn't pass the exam, then we can provide them with follow-up support for that. And again, rather than, not only do they take the certification exam each year, most school districts will do what they call an evaluation refresher, which is a one-day training for all of their existing faculty that passed it last year and are continuing to do observations. If they have new faculty, then we do obviously a whole new training for them. Good question.
All right, well, thank you all for staying a little bit late, and thank you again to the presenters.
Thank you.